Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Dania Thafer. I'm the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum. And today we're going to be having a panel titled Iran and the GCC, Pathways for Constructive Dialogue. And I guess the title is self-explanatory, but this panel is assembled to focus less on tensions of the region, which we know that we've heard of it so many times, and it's been repeated so many times among many different events and panels. We want to focus more on opportunities for constructive dialogue for this particular panel. And the Biden administration really finds itself negotiating at a point where they need to negotiate an Iran policy, not just with the Iranians themselves. They find partners in the Middle East pushing for their own agenda, Europe and other nations concerned with the Iranian file. With that in mind, it's important to highlight that there is kind of a mismatch in priorities of the EU and the US, depending on how you define them, from, for example, some of the Middle Eastern states, the GCC, or some of the Arab states. The former view regional security through the lens of checking Iran's nuclear ambitions primarily, whereas the latter view it from addressing Iran's wider regional ambitions. And with the new administration in Washington and really the devastating effect of COVID, I think the GCC is at a point that it recognized the time for resistance is really over, and there's more of a willingness among these states to work towards de-escalation. Yet Saudi Arabia and other GCC states have been adamant about addressing Iran's missile forces and its asymmetric capabilities throughout the region. And there has been deliberate efforts of lobbying in Washington with collaboration between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and also Israel to address kind of these region-wide issues. And you see that experts really from outside of the GCC, including from Iran, Lebanon, or Syria, are really haven't really been part of this discussion, but they really emphasize their concerns about being caught between the crossfire. So the issue of Iran and the GCC is really a bottleneck issue, and if it's resolved, it can be very rewarding region-wide. And so we think it's very important. Meanwhile, many have argued that returning to the JCPOA is something of a time-sensitive matter. Iran is slowly unraveling its compliance and has increased its enrichment of uranium. There is an upcoming election in June that could constrain Iranian domestic politics from returning to the JCPOA, and there are more conservative and more hardline elements growing in popularity there. So there's a lot to consider and think about when discussing this issue. On that note, how can the US and other nations institute enough leverage to incentivize regional talks, yet really check Iranian nuclear ambitions? Will Iran prove its resistance to both disincentivizing and incentives to change its regional policies, which make the US regional partners wary of US-Iranian engagement? And there's a lot of concern about what happened during the Obama era from other regional partners. Will Iran compromise on its national security interests? And Iran does view many of these issues to be part of its national security interests, and so do the other states as well. So where can we get to a point where this discussion is not a zero-sum game? Can the US establish a broad international coalition that can address the concerns and the primary grievances of regional stakeholders while meeting US objectives when it comes to Iran? So it's a balancing act. And what are the viable measures that some of the GCC states can compromise on? And what are some of those measures that Iran can compromise on? So naming some confident building measures from both perspectives would be really valuable. So I'm happy to introduce our distinguished panel. We have Dr. Abdulhadi AlAjmi. He's a professor at Kuwait University. He held many academic and research positions since 2004. He is the Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs and Graduate Studies at Kuwait University, as well as the head of the History Department. Dr. Ali Vaez is the Iran Project Director and Senior Advisor to the President of the Crisis Group. He led the Crisis Group's efforts in helping to bridge the gap between Iran and the P5+1 that led to the landmark 2015 deal. Previously, he served as a senior political affairs officer at the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and was the Iran Project Director at the Federation of American Scientists. Professor Ross Harisson. He is a senior fellow and director of research at the Middle East Institute. He's also a faculty of political science at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches courses on Middle East politics and US foreign policy. And Dr. Azadeh Zamirirad is the deputy head of the Middle East and Africa Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She covers Iran's domestic and foreign policy with a special focus on Iran's nuclear program. So welcome. I'm very pleased to have you all. We're going to begin with Ali Vaez.
Thank you very much, Dania. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'll start with actually talking a little bit about the perspective from Washington, and then I covered the Iranian perspective as well, and I'm sure Azadeh will add to it. Look, the Biden administration is comprised of people who actually served in the Obama administration and had the experience of trying to manage this difficult balance between addressing the urgent issue of Iran's nuclear program versus the important concerns about Iran's regional activities. And the way the Obama administration tried to address this issue was in a sequential manner. It first went to cap and limit Iran's nuclear program and put it under rigorous monitoring with the hope that then that would open opportunities for regional de-escalation in the future. But in fact, the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal in 2015, in fact, backfired on Yemen as the Obama administration had to basically turn around and support the Saudi-led effort in the war in Yemen, which has resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe. And so I think the Biden team has come to the conclusion that although it is important to try to limit Iran's nuclear program, but the only way that the deal would be stable is that if the context of broader enmity between Iran and the US and their respective allies in the region is also addressed. And this requires the regional de-escalation to occur in parallel to nuclear negotiations with Iran. Now, the way this needs to be done is not to add Saudi Arabia or the UAE or other regional countries to the P5+1 group, but primarily you can have the P5+1 Iran discuss the restoration of the JCPOA, and then once that is done, try to build a stronger and longer nuclear deal on top of it. And again, those discussions can still happen in the context of the JCPOA and P5+1. And then in parallel, there needs to be some kind of a regional dialogue process that the United States is not in a position to lead, but it can definitely support. A neutral actor like the United Nations or a core group of Scandinavian countries, for instance, would be much better placed to pursue this kind of regional dialogue. And you already see some initial signs in that direction. including the recent visits of UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, to Tehran for the first time since he was appointed to this position. And interestingly, this is actually a view that the Iranians share. They don't want to mix the two basket of issues, the nuclear issue and regional issues. And by the way, I put Iran's ballistic missiles program into the regional basket as well. The reason is this is primarily Iran's only viable deterrence that stems from its regional threat perceptions. And it has to be addressed as a regional issue and not just an Iran problem, because there are also other countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, or like Israel, who have longer range ballistic missiles. And obviously, this is a question of balance of power, balance of conventional military capabilities that has to be addressed as part of a regional arms control discussion. And so on this point, the Iranians actually agree with the Biden administration that there needs to be a separate process for regional discussions. I think the issue that the Iranians have is that they've always believed that their statements, their declaratory policy, that they're ready to engage with their neighbors in negotiations should be enough to open the door to these kind of discussions. But given the fact that there is tremendous amount of mistrust between the two sides, and the fact that the Saudis and the Emiratis, at least for the longest time, I feel that perception is changing. But for a very long time, their reluctance to talk to the Iranians, I think, primarily was rooted in the fact that they believed that the Iranians were in a position of strength. If you look at the regional files in Syria, in Lebanon, even in Iraq, the Iranians have been able to gain the upper hand. And they were hoping that the US would change the balance of power so that they could negotiate with the Iranians in a more leveled playing field. But the reality is 4 years of the Trump administration and 2.5 years of maximum pressure basically not only did not level the playing field, in fact, it backfired and rendered Iran much more aggressive in the region. And we witnessed several episodes in which we came very close to the brink of an all-out war or direct attacks on Saudi and Emirati soil and infrastructure. So without any doubt, I think the Iranians remain still in a relatively strong position. And so the onus is on the Iranians to match their rhetoric about preparedness to engage with their neighbors in good faith with confidence-building measures. Now, Yemen obviously is, a first place to start because the Iranians, for them, Yemen is not one of the key issues to their national security concerns and objectives, unlike Iraq or Syria or Lebanon. And so it is always a card that they can play. A lot of people call Yemen a low-hanging fruit. I actually think it's a low-hanging can of worms. And it might actually be very difficult to resolve the conflict itself. But some kind of de-escalation in which the Iranians can play a constructive role, I think would send the right signal to the Saudis and to the Emiratis that the Iranians, in addition to talking the talk, are willing to walk the walk, and would be an important gesture. It's obviously not sufficient, and there needs to be actions on the bilateral level as well. As you know, the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia was cut off when Saudi diplomatic facilities in Iran were attacked by a mob. And I think the Iranians owe an apology to Saudi Arabia, and also they need to pay compensation, which I hope then in turn will open up the possibility of restoring some degree of diplomatic representation, either through the Swiss, who were trying to negotiate this in 2017 and 2018, or even directly between the two countries. And then this could then open the door for additional discussions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And some of the confidence-building measures that they can then discuss include, again, some low-hanging fruits, like, for instance, toning down the very fiery rhetoric in respective medias in both countries, and discussions about Hajj, for instance, once the pandemic is over, and so on and so forth. But again, this all needs to happen in parallel to discussions between Iran and the P5+1 on restoration of the JCPOA and building on it, and in parallel in the regional dialogue process, which could also help create other confidence-building measures and people-to-people ties. I mean, one thing, honestly, that is very shocking about this region, that there are a limited number of regional organizations that are inclusive and address issues of common concern between these countries, from environmental issues to public health issues to energy security. There is basically nothing at the Persian Gulf level that would include all of these countries. And so there is a lot of room for institutions like the UN or for a core group of European countries to start building this, lay the groundwork for these kind of interconnections between the countries and bring about some serious confidence building measures that could change the dynamics. Let me stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ali. I just want to make one point for the audience is to make sure to post your questions early on so we can get to them. Next, we'll have Abdulhadi.
Different part of the conflict in the region, and I think he put it very well when he described the conflict that have two levels, have an international level in the sense that is related Iranian vis-a-vis the United States and the major players in the world, and a regional one between the Iranians and the GCC. And in that level also, we should remember that the GCC never came to in a conflict. Is clear the sound, the voice? Do you hear me well, Dana? So when we speak about this conflict between the GCC and the Iranian, we should remember it's always been that it is something through the international community. The Iranian never been in the issue with the GCC alone. It's since the revolution, the Iranian came in conflict with the whole international organization or with the West in general. And inside, in the shadow of this conflict, the GCC have been working with the Iranian, trying to avoid conflict. Of course, the Iraqi war, and after that, the historical thing that you know at all. However, we saw a moment where the GCC have tried to reach for the Iranian, have tried to create a connection that could work. However, most of these attempts being viewed by the Iranian in all of the ways that is a way to play more games in this context vis-a-vis the West. So whenever they try to pressure the West, they will do something inside the region. They will attack something. They will try to manipulate certain diverse in this GCC society. Going from there to the nuclear issue in general and the challenge that it will pose against the GCC. However, even in that level, the GCC never played the major role in controlling this issue. It's always been more the Israeli and the United States and the West. However, again, this question challenge the GCC. The stability of the region is a requirement for the GCC. But the Iranian never gave a chance to build a trust. Even if you rethink again all of these attempts, you will find that the Iranian never took the interests of their neighbors in consideration when they create their policy. They want to manipulate what they think it's a weakness. And when we go over the issues that the Iranian, the GCC want from Iran, you will not find in the opposite what the Iranian want from the GCC. There is no single militia that inside Iran that the GCC support. The GCC is not trying to impose interior conflict inside Iran. However, the Iranian doing the same in the region. Of course, Iraq an issue, Yemen an issue, Lebanon, Syria, all of these are an issue that the GCC have something to say about it. But still, the GCC now not in a position to force the Iranian in one of these places, except the Yemen conflict. And I agree with Ali. Yemen could be the place where the Iranian could negotiate or give something. However, if you rethink the Yemen issue, you will find that it's even hard for the GCC to adjust a total control of Iran, not for even the GCC to control Yemen. That is not an issue in the table, or the Iranian will not discuss such an issue. We have also, let's rethink Trump era. When we think about Trump contribution to the region, it's to rebalance the Iranian Obama era, or Iran strength from the Obama era. And of course, Trump did not succeed in all of these things, but however, show again that harm can be done. Restraint for the Iranian ambition in the region can be done. Also, if you see the region itself, if you go to Iraq now, after the Trump era, you will find the Iranian militias in Iraq have less power. Iranian militia in Syria have less power, but still Iraq in a conflict because of the Iranian. Syria the same. And of course, the Iranian have sent a message to the people. Of course, we speak always about this government, the GCC government, and most of them is not elected government. However, the people in the region, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, all of their hope of democracy, of changing, of future perspective, or changing of the system for a better life have been destroyed by mainly group that is related to Iran and by Iran present in this region. I will add one thing. For example, if you did see the GCC, you will find that they're not all of them in one package when they talk about Iran. You will find Kuwait and Oman is more closer to have a tone with Iran that is with more understanding for the Iranian, more cooperation with the Iranian from the Omani side, and we can say that about Kuwait. But if you go again to Kuwait, not Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, you will find that the Iranian in the moment where Kuwait came very much closer to the Iranian, still the Iranian have their group inside Kuwait, have created a militant group that gather weapon to create another Hezbollah in Kuwait. And you will see this is the equation now inside the GCC, that however, if you come much closer to the Iranian, they will do the same. They will go again to the same game, trying to create a Hezbollah inside your country, trying to destruct whatever system you have, established system that you have in your region. So opening with Iran is in itself, it's a challenge for those who are closer to Iran. And Iran will not give you a chance to treat the Iranian as a challenge in the level of economy or international relation. They will try to interfere inside your border and create a chaos, create another version of Hezbollah in every country. So I think the Iranian, in order to show a moment of change, that will be very much welcomed in the region, because most of these GCC country is in danger of any war between Israel and Iranian. The GCC, Kuwait, for example, I'm speaking about Kuwait at least, it's a big danger for Kuwait to have such a war, especially with this economical challenging that we're facing. So how can we move with Iran? Is Iran ready to go for a stable connection with the region, with the international community? I think whenever Iran have a stable and acceptable relation with the West, with the general international community, it will come to a point where it will understand that such relation with the GCC is possible and needed. I would like to remind you of what King Abdullah did when he invited Najad. And you remember Najad in that time, his tone and his challenges and all of the show that he represent. But still, King Abdullah called him in Mecca and tried to create a connection and tried to create a relation. But after that, you saw what happened with the Saudi embassy. So it's a dangerous game where the Iranian wants you always to be engaged in a challenge from the Iranians. They will never want to be a normal a neighbor that will cooperate with you, but he wants you to be in danger all of the time, and the relation will be under such circumstances. There is a great deal of opportunity of the Iranian change their attitude toward their neighbor. I think we will reach a moment where we will have to cooperate. I think a new Iraq will be a chance for the GCC and Iranian to cooperate to create a new Iraq that is not, if the Iranian want to change something. Rescue in Syria from the chaos now in Syria. If there is anything to come to agree with the GCC for a new system in Syria, where the GCC will come with the fund and with the helping the Syrian people, the Iranian will influence a little bit the new system and new regime. So there is chances. The issue of Yemen also, I agree with Ali. It's a chance for the GCC and Iranian to come across. But we need to think, would the Iranian will be in a moment ready to create a policy that is contrast, or to create a region, a way of conflict, because we think that the Iranian do invest in such conflict, invest in the unrest, because they as a system, the system use conflict to gain more. With more conflict, they think they could keep their inside issues, internal issues under control, making the people feel they are in challenge and danger, will stop the Iranian from seeking reform or change. And this is one of the things. But however, the neighboring country need to handle and to deal with such a system. So I think all of this issue, there is lots of things we can do, but we need first a will from the Iranian, and that will not come easily without an international decision or control or management for the Iranian behavior in the region. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Abdulhadi. And next, we will have Azadeh, Dr. Azadeh.
Yes, thank you, Dania, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, I was asked to talk a little bit more about Iran's perspective, what kind of suggestions Iran would be willing to make, and what kind of confidence-building measures would actually be feasible. Now, we are all aware of, the tensions and the difficulties and the obstacles that exist in the region. We are aware of the zero-sum mentality that exists. We know that insecurity in this region is essentially self-perpetuating and has been so for decades now. But at the same time, I agree with what Dania said in her introduction. There seems to be a higher degree of awareness and also a sense of urgency that de-escalation is a necessity at this point. We've seen escalatory measures being taken in these past years. We were quite close to a military escalation, and this cannot be in the interest of any regional actor, because if we see this kind of military escalation unfolding at some point, the region as a whole is quite likely to suffer. So there seems to be more political buy-in at this point, given the nature of how politics unfolded these past years. And I think this can be a positive kind of drive moving forward. Now, what is it that Iran has put on the table so far? Tehran, after the JCPOA, has suggested once again a regional dialogue forum. We've heard President Rouhani talk again and again about the HOPE initiative, that is the Hormuz peace endeavor, and Foreign Minister Zarif laying out a number of more concrete steps that could be taken. Some of these ideas that were put forward rest on the notion that it would be possible for regional actors to agree on a set of principles, guiding principles such as non-aggression, non-interference, non-intervention, refraining from threatening the use of force. They've made other suggestions regarding enhancing communication channels, having pre-notification in place for military exercises, establishing military contacts and ties, and having early warning systems in place. So there were a number of more concrete kind of suggestions put forward by the government. Can you still hear and see me?
Yes, we can.
Can you still hear me? Okay, because you were all gone for a second. Now, I think two aspects here when it comes to Tehran's suggestions are particularly noteworthy and of particular importance. One is Iran's notion that regional actors should all reject to participate in any kind of coalition building against each other. And this lies at the core of Iran's threat perceptions, this idea that it is essentially surrounded by a hostile environment of neighbors who are plotting and ploying together with extra-regional and other regional actors to topple the regime. So having this kind of anti-Iranian coalition building, this is the sense in Tehran, is one of its major concerns, and one of its kind of calls is for regional actors to refrain from these kind of coalition buildings. These assumptions and perceptions were strengthened by the Trump administration. If you all remember the MISA, the Middle Eastern Strategic Alliance, that never really materialized, but also more recently the Abraham Accords. All of this is seen through the lens of anti-Iranian coalition building that goes to the core of Iranian security perceptions here. The second one is Iran's call for a reduction of military expenditures and arms sales. Again, this goes to the core of Iranian security issues. Iran cannot really compete financially with other Gulf states, most notably Saudi Arabia, when it comes to purchasing arms. And it doesn't even have the same kind of options and chances on the international market here. And if we look at Saudi Arabia alone, if we look at recent numbers put out by CIPRI over arms imports over a period of 5 years, Saudi Arabia has become the biggest arms importer, and more than 70% of Saudi Arabian arms purchases were directly made, came from the US. So these two big baskets, this anti-coalition building against other regional actors and military spending, arms kind of expenditures and sales, are two very important points to Iran. If any changes were to be made on these fronts, these would essentially be game changers. Now, obviously, this is not very realistic, and Tehran knows that, and Tehran itself is not, at this point at least, really willing to make substantial concessions on parts of its security structures and setup. So what does that mean? What is actually feasible at this point if no side is really willing at this point to make substantial concessions? I think we can start with issues that lie outside of hard security, the hard security realm. I do agree with what Ali has said. I think Yemen can be an area where some progress can be made with regard to Iranian signaling. But other than that, I don't really see much substantial progress being realistic in the short term. What we can do, however, is to have technical cooperations and dialogues that focus on areas that lie specifically outside of hard security issues. And instead of aiming for broader comprehensive agreements and having a kind of a broader multilateral setting, it would probably be most feasible to start with bilateral cooperation and try to take it from there, expand it to trilateral and even potentially more multilateral formats that could address a number of issues here. The Gulf states all face environmental issues, questions of water management, waste management, questions of overfishing, questions of water and air pollution. All of these are areas where technical cooperation would be actually quite beneficial for all sides. Promoting intra-regional trade, something that particularly Oman and Iran and Qatar have taken up on more strongly recently. Countering trafficking, particularly with regard to narcotics, is another area where technical cooperation and logistical cooperation would be beneficial. And people-to-people relations, tourism, academic exchanges, and again, we've seen with Qatar and Iran more recently attempts to facilitate visa issuing processes. Now, all of these are feasible, they are practical, they can be managed, and they do not require high political buy-in from any side. In fact, you can have these kind of dialogues on a technical level. You can build task forces that expand the kind of cooperation and move it from there. Now, apart from that, what's still possible also is to have some kind of UN-supported political dialogue. And again, Iran regularly refers to UN Security Council Resolution 598, where the Secretary General was essentially asked to examine different kind of measures, how to destabilize and provide more security for the region. So it could be seen as some kind of UN mandate here, and Iran would be very much open to a UN-led kind of effort to work on regional security issues. And here we can address a number of other areas. I'm thinking of nuclear safety issues, counterterrorism issues, maritime security. Now, these are more intermediate level de-escalation measures and confidence building measures. The other ones that I mentioned earlier would be kind of an entry-level de-escalation point. We could also, under this kind of setting, be hopeful to achieve a certain set of agreements, including incidents at sea agreement, regional nuclear test ban, treaty. These are, I think, achievable goals. Now, none of these really require buy-in from all actors, and I think this is important to point here. Instead of trying to go for a comprehensive, all-inclusive kind of setup, which sounds good, but in reality is probably not really practical, I think it's already beneficial if we can start with a number of actors who are willing to find common ground and to move forward on any of these issues that I just mentioned. So if you even have 3 or 4 countries trying to agree on a nuclear test ban treaty, that will already be a big progress that could potentially have positive spillover effects down the road. So this is more of a patchwork approach to regional security with different degrees of security priorities, where I think larger structures could actually gradually evolve out of smaller bilateral, trilateral, multilateral talks and agreements. And I think this is probably the most practical way to move forward, and essentially a prerequisite for tackling much more complex, hard security issues down the road. But we shouldn't have any illusion that at this point in time or anytime soon, we would see drastic kind of substantial security concessions on each side. These kind of measures that I just laid out, I think, can be first building blocks in terms of confidence building that at some point maybe can lead us into a different phase.
Thank you, Azadeh, for the methodical and practical recommendations. Next, we will have Ross Harisson. He'll be our last speaker, but certainly not our least. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Dania, for that introduction. It's an honor to be here with you today and on the platform, virtual platform, with my esteemed colleagues. You know, there's a certain amount of risk in being an optimist when it comes to the Middle East generally, and specifically GCC-Iran relations, because you have a pretty high probability of being wrong most of the time. So it's a lot safer to be a pessimist. I think in my comments today, I'm going to be neither an optimist or a pessimist, but I do want to point to some of the important conditions in the region today that could be building blocks to play a little bit on, build on what Azadeh mentioned, could be building blocks towards a brighter future. Now, this should not be construed as predicting that these building blocks will be assembled in any kind of constructive way to move towards a brighter future, but at least it's important to lay out what the conditions are there or in the region today that could become critical pathways towards a more constructive dialogue between the GCC countries and Iran. You know, I'm the last person in the world to sing the praises of the Trump administration's policies towards the Middle East. In almost every case, I would say that they were failures, and in some cases, in my view, a disaster. But there were certain conditions that occurred during that era that I think are important to focus on. And some of them have been addressed in at least tangentially by previous speakers. You know, when the United States renounced and then withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, in May of 2018, Iran, for the most part, over the ensuing year, complied with the limits imposed on enrichment of uranium as a result of that deal. And then a year after the U.S. backed away from its commitments under the deal, Iran was convinced that the United States was intent on waging economic warfare on the Islamic Republic, and decided that this could not be cost-free either to the United States or to its allies in the region, many of which are, you know, GCC countries. And so it took increasingly escalatory measures in the Persian Gulf in terms of ships disrupting shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, mining ships, and so forth, and then culminating in in the alleged attacks, anyway, on by Iran or Iran-sponsored proxies on the Saudi Aramco Abqaiq facilities, I believe in September of 2019. Why do I recount that history? Because I think it's important to understand that this created a bit of a gestalt shift, I think, certainly in the UAE and possibly even Saudi Arabia, to indicate that being a spoiler in terms of US-Iranian relations was not going to come cost-free. Because they had, as you remember, during the JCPOA negotiations, they felt that they were sidelined and it ultimately became spoilers. And they egged on the Trump administration to become increasingly hostile towards Iran. And I think the outcome of these attacks indicated that, number one, that if there is some kind of kinetic conflict military conflict between the United States and Iran, or even Israel and Iran, the likely victims, as other speakers have said, are likely to be the UAE and possibly even Saudi Arabia. So I think the notion that there needs to be a way forward that does not involve deepening the hostilities between the United States and Iran, I think has become internalized in the decision-making structures in Abu Dhabi, if not in possibly even Riyadh. Related to that, I think, is the fact that after the Abqaiq attacks, the U.S. essentially did nothing, and so I think the way that was internalized in the GCC countries is that the Carter Doctrine, which essentially imposed a security umbrella on top of in the Persian Gulf, had expired, and that the deterrent structures that the U.S. has in the region had roughly 65,000 troops in the region between various venues, bases, and then in the GCC countries and also in Iraq and Afghanistan. The deterrent effect had also not worked. So I think there's an indication that there aren't many options available other than thinking about a pathway towards cooperation. And I think Azadeh laid out some of the obstacles, but also some of the opportunities, some of the moving parts towards that cooperation. But there needs to be, I think there's a recognition and a receptivity to the fact that they have to find a way forward. There aren't too many options. They can't rely necessarily on the United States. They can't rely on China. GCC countries can't rely on China for their security. They can't rely on Russia. And even the budding relationship between several GCC states and Israel is really shy of a security framework and treaty arrangement. So I think there is this sort of receptivity or understanding that the status quo is not sustainable and that there has to be a change. And I think that's a positive possible outcome of what happened in the last few years. What are some of the other pieces that I think could be building blocks, or at least conditions on the ground that could be constructive? One has already been mentioned. I think some kind of diffusion of the war in Yemen, or at least the proxy dynamic of the war in Yemen. Martin Griffith, the UN envoy for Yemen, visit to Tehran and his efforts, and then backed by the Biden administration, I think can go a long way, certainly if there's a solution there, in reducing some of the threat perceptions on the part of Riyadh. And I think that could go a long way towards setting the stage for some kind of broader regional cooperation. I think it's also important to mention that I think in the region today, there is a growing awareness that this GCC-Iran rivalry is part of a bigger conflict system. It's not just a personal blood feud between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or the UAE. I'm sorry, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or the UAE and Iran. That dimension is there, obviously, but that this is part of a bigger conflict system. You have Turkey becoming increasingly aggressive in the region, in Syria, in Libya, in the Eastern Med, and also in Nagorno-Karabakh and the Caucasus. That you have an aggressive Turkey. You have aggression, as has been mentioned, at the sub-regional level on the part of Iran, and you have obviously conflicts in the region that don't even involve Iran, that involve a proxy dynamic between Turkey, Qatar on one side, and the UAE on the other, in Libya. So I think even though the Turkey's increasingly assertive role doesn't directly mitigate conflict between the GCC states and Iran, I think it points to the fact that that this is a bigger conflict system that has to be dealt with along some of the lines that other speakers have mentioned in terms of a regional framework. What are some of the wildcard factors? And this is where I think the Biden administration can play a fairly active role. I agree with Ali that the United States cannot play the lead role in any kind of a regional dialogue. It can play a supporting role, but given the history over the last number of years, I don't think it can play a lead role. But here's one area where I think it could play a very positive role. You know, the Abraham Accords are a wild card factor. They can either stoke further regional rivalries, or they can help become a conflict mitigant. I think the Trump administration intended the Abraham Accords to be the foundation of a anti-Iran axis in the region. And I think that was also the motivation on some of the, at least in the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu, for serving as a bulwark and as a cudgel against Iran. If in fact that's what is intended, or if that's what actually happens, then frankly, I have no real optimism in terms of building any kind of regional collaboration, because it just creates a whole new axis for some form of rivalry, and that will drive Iran into furthering its tentacles into the civil war zones of the Middle East, possibly leading to a more aggressive Turkey. And so I don't think it's helpful at all. And so it could go that way. If the Biden administration sends the signal, I think, that this should be seen as a sub-regional structure that could be built upon, not in the immediate period. I think we're in a period where just getting tensions defused would be a win and a goal for the United States and for the regional actors, but ultimately use that as a sub-regional platform for forging broader forms of cooperation ultimately involving Turkey and possibly even involving Iran down the road. Then I think this kind of a sub-regional structure, which is somewhat new and novel, could become a positive dynamic or positive asset in terms of moving forward. So do I think that all of the convergence of all of these things will lead to further cooperation? I think that's a bit of a bridge too far, as other speakers have spoken to. It does come down to leadership. It comes down to political will. Do these factors generate enough traction in terms of creating political will that it will move the agenda forward? Probably not, certainly not in the next couple of years. But I think the real other wild card factor here is leadership from Washington, but primarily leadership from on the Iranian side, from the Saudi side, and from the UAE side, and other actors, other members of the GCC community. I mean, it's an easy thing to say, but we always say that Middle Eastern leaders never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I hope that is not true in the future. I think, given the conditions that I laid out, I think there are some opportunities and nuggets for advancing a broader form of cooperation between the northern and southern shores of the Persian Gulf. But it's going to require a heavy diplomatic agenda, some leadership from the United States, some ability for the United States to create at least an issue-specific cooperation on the part of other international actors outside the region, and sending the right signals to the regional actors. If that can happen, and if there is sufficient political will to advance towards a better future, then I think we have some hope. But we can have that conversation about whether the political will is likely to appear to take advantage of some of these assets, maybe in the Q&A. Thank you very much. I'll end there.
Thank you, Ross. So now we're going to segue into the Q&A portion of the discussion. And one question that I wanted to pose to the panelists, because I've heard some views that probably the US or the EU shouldn't really be involved in the next step of regional dialogue. I mean, there's a certain amount of consensus that the JCPOA should be negotiated first, and then there should be a regional dialogue among regional players. But my question is wouldn't it be beneficial to have the US put its leverage behind a regional dialogue? For example, and this is obviously on a different scale or scope, with regards to the GCC crisis. Once the Trump administration put its full leverage behind resolving it, I mean, some important parts of it was resolved. So I think it might be important to have a little bit more leverage from the West to support regional dialogue, especially that some of the issues that are grievances among all the players are related to their interests in the region as well. Would anyone like to take a stab to this question? Could you elaborate more about this issue? Yes, Ross.
I'll be happy to start it. I think one thing is important to understand is that the United States has been a protagonist in the GCC-Iran rivalry, not just a party on the outside. So the ability, can you hear me, Dania?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. It's entangled in that conflict directly. So the ability for the United States to use its power to convene and bring all the regional actors together, I think, is a bit of a bridge too far, because that's going to be construed, I think, by the Iranians, maybe rightfully so, given the legacy of the Trump administration, as a way for the United States to build a coalition against Iran. So I happen to agree with Ali's comment in that it's likely perhaps a more neutral country, whether it's a European country or Japan or some other country that has a vested interest in this issue, but is not seen as a protagonist in the conflict directly, I think would be a more constructive, play a more constructive role. You mentioned the role that the United States played in bridging the gap between Qatar and other GCC states. That's true, but that's a very, very different set of threat perceptions. Intense rivalry for sure, and deep issues, but it's a very, very different kind of conflict than we have in the Iran GCC states, where the United States has played an active role. Iran sees the United States as its primary nemesis, and it sees Saudi Arabia and the UAE as the tip of the, along with Israel, as the tip of the spear towards those efforts. So I think the U.S. involvement has to be, in terms of a regional dialogue, has to be supportive, but I don't think it can use its power to convene at this point to create any kind of constructive dialogue, unless it's part of a broader international framework involving other international actors. Then perhaps.
Thanks, Ross. Does anyone else have something they'd like to add to that?
Dania, if I may, while I agree 100% with Ross, I think there is a way for the U.S. to put pressure on its own allies in the region to take regional dialogue more seriously. But I also think that there is a way of getting the P5 involved in these negotiations, but as observers, not as active participants in the talks. The reason I say this is that you hear often from regional countries that they see in U.S. or their other European allies' participation in the region as means of, sort of strengthening their hand in dealing with the Iranians. And you often hear from the Iranians that they don't see extra-regional powers to, have any role in this give and take that at the end of the day would have to happen between regional countries. So, but I think there is a way of bridging this, which is that if the U.S. would support the UN or anybody else who's willing to lead the talks and encourage its allies in the region to participate, if you look at what Azadeh referred to, which is the Iranian insistence that the UN has the ability to do this through Resolution 598, basically Resolution 598, because it's a Security Council resolution, it has obviously a very special place for the P5. So the P5 can participate in these talks as observers. And also remember that China now has a great stake in this region. It relies for a good part of its energy security on imports of energy from not just Iran, but also Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And the fact that the Russians also came up with their own model for de-escalation and dialogue in the region in 2019. So they are also extremely interested. And I think the P5 can play a supportive role behind the scenes of any kind of regional dialogue process.
If I can add, Dana, also to this thing, that actually there is, in the past, there is a certain attempt from the GCC, also from the Iranian. I mentioned the one between Najad and King Abdullah. This is the American, not part of it, but still, can the American weight in this issue be dismissed in such a negotiation without the U.S. present? So it doesn't need to be the U.S. present in the negotiation, but the weight is there. The positions vis-a-vis the American policies in the region. So if the American will not attend the negotiation between the Saudis and the Iranian, does that will mean that the American is not present vis-a-vis these issues? And as you see, the Biden positions vis-a-vis Yemen, that will affect the Saudi for sure. They affect the Iranian. So in the end, when we speak about negotiation without the United States, what are we speaking about? Is it that will the weight of these parties will change because the Americans are not there as part of this negotiation? I think most of the major issues that there is a conflict in regard of related to the international community's views toward the Iranian policy in the region. So which of these issues that is dangerous and we will work it well with the Iranian without the American? Can you name things? Most of these things, I think the GCC have met with the Iranian many times without the American. Still, they will do it again and again. And the Omanians are engaged very well with the Iranians. But the issues that there is a conflict about is related to mainly the major ones that can be, or we think that we need to solve, related to American interest in the region as well. So it's not an issue that when the American will not be part of the negotiation, then the American interest is not there. No, most of these issues related to each other. And I think the other issues like academic connection or economical connection, I think these have been working without the American. The UAE economic relationship with Iran is very well, and the Omani, the Kuwaitis, and the Saudi are, I think, they're ready to go to this step without the American. But I think the conflicts related to another issue, for example, Iraq, Syria, would the American be there in such a discussion or not? When you speak about the American out of a discussion, do you speak about, for example, the stability of Iraq or the new government in Iraq, militia in Iraq? So these are issues related to the American, related to the GCC, and related to Iran as well. So we should rethink what do we mean by regional only.
Thank you.
May I also add some points to that, Dania?
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. A number of points here. I think when we talk about US involvement, we are kind of assuming that this would be sort of a smooth process in the sense that US would have enough leverage or the convening power even to bring together, forget about Iran, but other Gulf states here. And I think what Ross has laid out is very important. In many ways, we don't just deal with trust issues between regional actors, but at this point, given the developments of these past years, there are also trust issues between particular Gulf states and extra-regional powers. That is between, let's say, Saudi Arabia and the United States. Think about the attacks on the Saudi Aramco facilities. Think about the fact that these actors were not at the negotiation table in nuclear negotiations for years, who felt that they were needed, that their voices were not heard. So I think when we talk about CBMs in the region, there are some CBMs also needed with regard to certain Gulf actors and their relationship with the United States, which needs to be put under scrutiny now again on the Biden administration. That's one part of it. The second part, I'm happy to hear that Ross also mentioned Japan. Obviously, the world does not just consist of the United States and Europeans. There are other actors as well who have quite, reliable and good relations to a number of regional states here. That is not to say that the United States or the EU shouldn't play a role. I think they should play a role, but in the end, first of all, we would have to think about other actors to involve as well who could play a role. And secondly, the question is what kind of role these actors are supposed to play and what kind of talks we are talking about here. Are we talking about, let's say, the United States being the convening power or Europeans being the convening power, or are they to take over the role of the financier, the ones that financially support certain activities? Are they the ones who provide technical support? I think the role definition is unclear here. I think depending on different areas, Europeans, for instance, can play a role. In other areas, they can play a far less significant role. Europeans don't really have a convening power, but they can provide substantial technical assistance when it comes to some of these confidence-building measures that I mentioned before, nuclear safety, for instance, and environmental issues, maritime security. This is where Europeans can play an effective technical role. So that's the one part of it, and the other one, again, depending on what kind of talk we are talking about, there can be different actors involved. So once again, just to reiterate, I don't think we are talking about a comprehensive kind of regional approach with a number of different regional and extra-regional actors necessarily, but we can start with sub-regional and subtopical kind of talks, which could include different actors at different times, depending on the kind of things that they could actually bring to the table that would be helpful.
And so what I'm gathering here from the discussion, what I've gathered from also statements from the GCC and from Iran, is Iran really prefers to have a regional dialogue with only the regional players. And the GCC prefers to have a dialogue that has outside players that can institute leverage in the dialogue. So there needs to be actually a discussion about how dialogue should be approached, because there's obviously disagreement in even how and who should be involved in the dialogues. I want to talk a little bit about the GCC itself.
Dana, if you could give me a 1 minute, for example. Now,
okay, because we want to continue. Okay.
Yeah, 1 minute only. For example, we can take the Omani-Qatari good relation now and Kuwaiti good relation to start something from there. I think the Qatari is in position where they can handle more engagement, maybe the Omani as well. But Kuwait is suitable to create venues to find a way to cooperate in one issue in the region, one only issue, that the Iranian will show something, that we can do something in the region without the American. Let's make it anything for the stability of the region. That will help much in creating a way to convince everyone to, as a pattern, as a way to repeat the model, create a one single model of cooperation between the GCC and one issue. Then we can keep going on from there.
Dania, your microphone is muted.
It's still muted. Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the issues I wanted to bring up, and I generally cover the GCC. As Abdulhadi has mentioned, the balance actually has tipped a little bit in the GCC towards more dialogue with Iran, believe it or not, because of the changes with Qatar. Kuwait has, a decent relation with Iran, and Oman has a pretty good relationship with Iran. And then the UAE has shown a little bit openness to dialogue and has a lot of commercial interests with Iran. So the balance has tipped a little bit, and I think there is more opportunity for dialogue than there has been historically. Of course, Saudi Arabia is an important actor with regards to the GCC, and it does have a lot of weight in that regard. But I think we should not totally discount the smaller states. When we discuss Iranian GCC issues, there always tends to be a focus just on Saudi and Iran, and I think that maybe more perspectives about that. And then going into Yemen, the Yemen war, and in which Ali he brought up, could be an area where there can be confidence building measures. So the different GCC states also have different roles in the Iran war, and they have different interests at stake. Oman borders Yemen, so it has a stake in the war, but has great relations with Iran. And Qatar has a little bit of history with regards to some involvement in the war, but it withdrew from the war. And then you have Kuwait, who has really tried to stay out of it as much as possible and has a long history of dealing with conflicts in Yemen and negotiating them and shuttle diplomacy, and really uses more of an overt shuttle strategy than Oman, which is more covert in nature. So, I mean, there are other ways in which the smaller GCC states can play a role. But I do think that the U.S.'s role cannot be discounted. The EU's role cannot be discounted. Now, moving on to questions, other questions. Since each GCC country has its own pathway for dialogue engagement, Miran, do you think they could craft one sound unified position for dealing with Iran? And does anyone have a recommendation for one solid thing? I mean, it doesn't have to be resolving all of the problems. Okay.
Is that question for me?
It's if you want it to be for you.
Yeah, actually, because it seemed that I have to answer it anyway. This is a very deep thing in the GCC, that we do not have one foreign policy, and especially, for example, when we speak the model of Qatar, Oman, especially the Qataris have always been far away from the Saudi's foreign policies in certain stages, but not, for example, not in Syria. Syria and Qatar were, the Saudi and the Qataris were very close when this issue started. However, the GCC trying to come closer to a one tone, at least. It's not there yet, but in certain issue, yeah, they agree. The GCC as a council, they keep having their meeting even during the conflict with Qatar. So I think we do not have a united position, but we can create a united negotiation position. So, for example, we could mix the Qataris, Saudis, Omani to reach a point where it's a point that is ready or easy to negotiate with. So at least we have a team. Let's make the GCC as a team that has some group who's much closer to give the Iranian more and create a way for a negotiation.
Okay, thank you very much, Abdulhadi. So there's a question from the audience that says, why might the coming Iranian elections either undermine or delay the return of the US and Iran into the JCPOA when the supreme leader has said openly and signaled that his support for such a move?
I'm happy to tackle that. So look, it's true that in Iran there is basically an institutional position that is reflected by the supreme leader. But without any doubt, presidents matter, and their team matters. In diplomacy, people matter. And so if the U.S. is to not negotiate restoration of the JCPOA with the same people who negotiated it, and waits and gambles for whoever comes next in August of 2021, I think it's basically taking major risks, because who knows who the next Iranian president would be, what kind of attitude he would have. Even if the supreme leader still wants restoration of the JCPOA, the negotiations could be very difficult, because the new people might not have the institutional memory that the current team in place, Rouhani and Zarif and others, do. And I also don't think that the U.S. actually wants to wait until it knows the outcome of Iranian elections. It has questions of whether the Iranians want a deal prior to the elections, because restoration of the JCPOA is going to have electoral implications in Iran. If sanctions are lifted and the economic situation improves, there might be more dynamism within the society, which can translate into higher participation rates. And usually higher participation rates favors the more moderate forces of Iranian politics. So I think the Biden administration does wonder whether Iran wants to resolve this issue before its own presidential elections or not. But in any case, I think it is in the interest of both sides to move as quickly as possible. Look, just in the past 4 weeks, the kind of public posturing that both sides have engaged in, I think, has made the return to the JCPOA more difficult. The steps that the Iranians are going to take next week, including limiting the UN inspectors' access to Iran's nuclear facilities, is going to increase tensions. And this is a legislation. This is based on a legislation that the Iranian parliament approved in November after the top nuclear scientist was assassinated. and the government will have to oblige and implement this legislation, which gradually increase their nuclear capabilities while decreasing the transparency measures that the JCPOA brought about. And also look at what's happening in the region with what happened in Iraq with the rocket attacks in Erbil. Every single day and every single week, there is new escalation and opportunities for spoiling a potential return to diplomacy. So, the bottom line is, I think it's really in the interest of both sides to start moving in the direction of JCPOA revival, even if the complete return to compliance might not materialize before the June elections. But I'm still cautiously optimistic that it would be done before the next Iranian president comes to office in August.
Thanks,
Can
Adri.
I add to that, Dania?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with everything Ali has said. Just to add a couple of points. Yes, the supreme leader is essentially the ultimate decision maker in Iran, but he does not operate in a political vacuum. And in fact, he has changed his position several times over the years. If you look at 2003, when he allowed for temporary voluntary suspension of any enrichment of uranium, to the Ahmadinejad era, where he allowed for heavily expanding the nuclear program, where we had enrichment rates of 20% for the first time, to relighting the JCPOA in 2015 that heavily restricted Iran's nuclear program across the board. He can change his position. He has changed his position in the past. He can change his position in the future and is likely to do so if the nuclear domestic debate also shifts. And this is what we're currently seeing right now. My main concern is that we are in a situation right now where both Tehran and Washington actually announced that they want to come back into full compliance, that they have an interest in coming back, but that we end up with a situation where one side is dragging out the process by not taking the first step. And in the end, we might get overwhelmed by domestic dynamics in Iran. This is a scenario that is not as unrealistic as it may sound. So you should prepare yourself for that. And whoever becomes president in Iran, whether it's a hardliner or not, will find a domestic environment now that is much more open to changing the course. So I would not rule out Iran taking a completely different political tone and a political policy with regard to the nuclear deal. I'm still optimistic that we can move forward constructively because I think there's still a will there and there's still a chance for the United States and the Europeans to act, but they need to act fast. So I think when you look at Iran, you look at the supreme leader, it's good to look at him. He is the ultimate decision maker, but don't underestimate the role of other actors in Iran's domestic sphere and how they impact his decision making. They have done so in the past, they can do so again.
Thank you. So we are running out of time. I know that we could discuss way more. It's a big topic, and there's many different aspects of it that we haven't fully addressed yet. But I would like to give every panelist 1 minute to just make any points that they want to make about regional dialogue. Ross? You're muted.
Sorry. I think one of the things that's important to leave this discussion with is the fact that, this is a region that's undergoing transformation. We're focused today primarily on the GCC-Iran relationship, but as I alluded to earlier, in terms of Turkey's involvement, Israel's involvement, this is part of a bigger conflict system. If there's any good news, and I don't find much good news in the Middle East today at all, is that for centuries, this is a region that was heavily controlled and influenced by outside powers, European powers and the Cold War powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This is a moment when the region is transforming itself. Unfortunately, that transformation is taking place not so much between states directly. There's very few territorial claims that one state in this conflict system have on each other. It's taking place inside a collapsed regional order, inside the countries that are at civil war. Syria, Yemen, previously Libya, previously Iraq, and so forth. And I think it's important to understand that the United States and other actors can play a role, but they can't play the lead role. This is an internal process. The regional actors are going to have to find a way forward. I think one of the things that the United States can do is take the Hippocratic Oath, which is just do no harm, which is try to not be a protagonist in this conflict, play to the best instincts of our allies, as Ali mentioned, play to the best instincts of our allies, not the worst instincts, which is what I think the Trump administration did, and use its soft power to the degree it has it to work with the international community and regional powers to bring them together. But this is an internal transformation process. The regional actors have agency and they need to take it.
Again, I'm muted. Thanks, Ross. So we're going to go in the opposite order we did for our panel. So Azadeh.
Yes, thank you. Overall, I think that the time is ripe for de-escalation measures. And I think there's much more interest in looking for ways to de-escalate. My main kind of point would still be that we think less about, maybe it's not very visionary and it's quite technical, but we think less about how to move forward with the wide, comprehensive kind of approach and more about concrete steps on a sub-regional level in different variations with different actors involved and take it from there. I think that will be very helpful, and this is something that we can build upon. From Iran's point of view, just to add that, I think as long as the nuclear crisis and issue is not kind of solved and put behind, I don't see any real chances of Iran making any substantial kind of concessions or even entering serious talks about anything beyond the nuclear file. So the nuclear crisis and solving it, I think, is a prerequisite to have a chance with Iran to move beyond that. But apart from that, again, I think on the sub-regional, sectoral level, some cooperation is possible that can evolve into something bigger. It's the experience of the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War. This was not achieved in a matter of months. It took so many years and different kind of negotiations, arms control negotiations, really serious concessions, and a lot of CBMs. And you need to put in kind of the patience if you want to get something really big and serious out of it.
Thank you, Azadeh. I'm afraid that Abdulhadi might have fell off somehow. Maybe he had some. He's back. Okay, Abdulhadi, welcome back. So, would you like to give your 1 minute rundown on some perspective that you might have missed or you want to add? Can you hear me, Abdulhadi? No. Okay. Let's go to Ali first, and we'll try to get back to Abdulhadi.
Thank you very much, Dania. So I really don't have much to add to what Ross and Azadeh have already said. I agree with them. I think the first step in this process is for the regional countries to realize that they are in a lose-lose dynamic. I mean, all of these ideas of let's see if we can bog down our regional rival into a proxy conflict and weaken them. Let's see if we can strangulate them with sanctions. Let's see if we can get external support and strengthen our hand. All of this has come at a huge price for the region and its people, at the expense of prosperity in this region. And now that we're talking about basically digging ourselves out of the situation that we're in terms of both tensions and also post-COVID recovery, I think time has come for these countries to engage in something that is not zero-sum. Even though, as others have said, this will take some time. We should temper our expectations in terms of what is possible. And if you look at other regions in the world, like the Helsinki process took many, many years. But again, even the longest journey should start with a first step.
Abdulhadi, can you hear us?
Dan, I do not hear you.
You do not hear me. So,
Abdulhadi, if you can hear me,
yeah, I can hear you.
We're just waiting for your 1 minute final.
Okay, this is again show that the Iranian and the GCC are much closer than people in DC. Anyway, and that can show that we can manage if we try to with such a good the region need a cooperation and need a peaceful treatment to our dangerous issue. I think we expect in the GCC that the Iranian have took a small lesson from the destruction that that such aggressive policies have caused in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. And I think the whole experience in itself is it's harmful for everyone. I think a more careful policies, and I think the Iranian people will have a part to say something in the coming election, where government can reposition itself toward more constructive policies in the region, more peaceful mindset that go for cooperation and gain from relation, not from conflict tone toward the rest of the region. I think there is hope of the change that come within the region, but we need the time, as you said, and everything possible with God will and God hopes. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for their insights and thought-provoking perspectives. Hopefully 2021 will be a year of de-escalation. We've seen enough escalation in the last couple of years. I want to thank our panelists for their time and our audience for joining us for this discussion. We have a few other upcoming events and discussions focusing on climate change in the region and economic issues related to the GCC. Thank you very much, and looking forward to engaging with you all further at another time.
Thank you.
Thank you.